Chapter 1. When I stepped out of my bedroom ready to leave, Mum gasped, "You can't go like that!" and pushed me back into the bedroom. We were going to a Sabiha, the Bosnian name for a party. Zabavas were organised twice a year, once as a community meet and greet, the second to celebrate Ramadan, the Muslim religious month of fasting. This would be my first attendance. "Why not?" I demanded, my hands on my hips as I twirled. I wore a little black dress Mum bought for my 15th birthday. I'd grown in the year since, and the dress moulded to my body. I wore the dress a few months before, when we attended a work barbecue for Dave, Mum's ex-boyfriend. Mum complimented me then. "It's not suitable." Mum rifled through my wardrobe. Even though both my parents are from Bosnia, I didn't have anything to do with the community. When I was 6 years old, Mum moved us to the inner city. Now, when I was 16, we were back where we'd started, in St. Albans. Even though St. Albans was established in 1887, at least that's what the plaque at St. Albans train station said, you couldn't tell by walking through the bustling centre. The buildings are 2-storey plain block structures with tin roofs. The shop fronts are a mix of European, who settled after the post-World War II boom, and Vietnamese, who came in the 1970s. St. Albans' only distinguishing feature was the streets formed into perfect rectangles, an absence of trees on nature strips, and the fact that every second shop is a pharmacy catering to the ageing population. There were always Yugos in St. Albans, and after the Balkan War in the early 1990s, the population exploded with refugees from all sides settling there. It wasn't a coincidence that Mum and I moved away, while everyone else moved into St. Albans. I never thought of myself as Bosnian. I was born in Australia. All my friends were Australian. And if I thought about it all, I would have called myself a true blue Aussie. All that changed 3 months ago. "What's wrong with my dress?" I admired myself in the mirror. "You're too beautiful, hot, gorgeous, sexy." I cocked my hip. The black dress brought out the highlights in my dark blonde hair. The V-line showed off my cleavage, while the miniskirt made my legs look longer. My bedroom door was pushed open. "Hajmo!" My grandfather demanded that we leave. He caught a glimpse of me. "Bože sačuvaj," he hissed, which meant, "God save us," and turned his back so he couldn't see me. "Bahra, nađi joj nešto drugo da obuče." His torrent of Bosnian came in lightning-fast bursts. I understood that he wanted my mum, Bahra, to find me something else to wear. What would people think if they saw how I was dressed? That I was a whore. And then I lost him. "Did Dido call me a whore?" "He said you look like a whore because of your makeup." My grandparents were supposed to come to Australia with my Aunt Zera and her family after the Balkan War in 1995, but my grandmother's diabetes made her too ill to travel. When my grandmother passed away last year, my grandfather came to Australia and lived with my Aunt Zera and Uncle Hakia. Unfortunately for me, that lasted a few months before Uncle Hakia and Dido couldn't stay under the same roof. Auntie Zera manipulated Dido into leaving, apparently by telling him that Bahra needed to be with him after all these years. And then she served up a good dose of guilt to her sister about being the black sheep, and about all the embarrassment Mum caused by shacking up with an Aussie. So, Mum caved in, and she and I made the move back to the western suburbs. and did or moved in with us. And my life became hell because of him. I checked my makeup in the mirror. My foundation was flawless, making my pale skin blemish-free. The liquid eyeliner and eyeshadow brought out my green eyes. I was wearing the basic makeup any teenage girl would wear to an evening function. "He's whacked, Mum." She glanced at my face quickly. "You'll have to tone it down." "But I'm wearing regular makeup." "We need to make a good impression," Mom sighed. "You're saying we're not good enough." "No." Mom put her hands on my shoulders. "Tonight is a very important night. It's the first time we're attending a Bosnian function as a family, and we're all anxious about looking our best." I had to admit, tonight was Mom's night. During the refugee onslaught, my Auntie Zara's family had arrived from Bosnia, and we'd managed to play happy families for a total of 2 years before Mom and Auntie Zara had a falling out. We hadn't had anything to do with each other during the 10 years we lived in the inner city, but tonight was the reunion. She hugged me, but I held myself stiff in her embrace. "I look great." I pulled away from her, forcing her to look at me. "Don't I?" Mom hesitated. "Yes, you do." "What are we waiting for? Let's go." I headed for the door. "But this isn't an Australian function. This is a Zabava. Everyone will be watching us, judging me." Mom winced. Mom and I weren't what you would call traditional Bosnians. More like exiles returning to the fold. Mom had made some bad decisions. At the age of 18, she married my father, who brought her to Australia. After my birth, she had a nervous breakdown and went to hospital. My dad left us because he didn't want a mental patient for a wife. So Mom embarked on what I called her finding a daddy phase when she dated every Bosnian man in sight, supposedly to find a father for me. Some lasted a night, some a week, some a few months. But inevitably, they all left us. She ended up getting a bad reputation, and this was one of the reasons why we moved out of St. Albans. "Please, Sam, Sabiha, be good for me." For years, I'd called myself Sammy Omerovic, and so had Mom. It was the easier option, because most Australians had to be taught to pronounce the H in my name. And then there was the deciding incident. I'd been looking forward to grade 6 camp the whole year. We went to a farm in Victoria's countryside, and I had fantasies of milking cows and riding horses. But what I hadn't envisioned was my camp leader and his wife. On the first day of camp, Mr. Howard asked all the students for their name. When it was my turn, the conversation went something like this. "Mr. Howard, that's an interesting name. Where are you from?" "Me. Thornbury." "Mr. Howard." "No," he laughed. "Which country?" "Me. Australia." "Mr. Howard, your name isn't Australian." "Me. It's Bosnian." "Mr. Howard, ah, so you're Bosnian." That should have been the end of the story. But then I met his wife. "Mrs. Howard, where's your name from?" "Me. I'm Bosnian." "Mrs. Howard, when did you come to Australia?" "Me. I was born here." "Mrs. Howard, so you're Australian." "Me. Yes." While I had many conversations that went along these lines, what made this so different was that Christy Newman, my grade 6 nemesis, witnessed both. She made the 3-day camp a living hell by calling me Sabiha No Country. When I came home from camp, I told Mom I wanted to change my name to something more Australian. By the time I began high school, I had a clean slate and everyone knew me as Sammy Omerovich. Now that we were embracing our ethnic roots, I was Sabiha again. Bahra! My grandfather was getting angrier with Mum. There's nothing suitable here. Mum closed my wardrobe doors. Find something in my wardrobe. Mom, I whinged. Please, Sabiha. Mom gave me a harried look and went to answer Dido's demands. I sighed heavily as I rifled through Mum's wardrobe. It used to be fun playing dress-ups in Mum's wardrobe when I was a child. But now it would be a disaster. Mum was a few inches taller than me, and her figure was fuller. Anything I put on would hang like a sack. As I pushed her clothes along, a parcel fell at my feet. I bent and picked up a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. I pulled a letter out, but it was written in Bosnian, and I couldn't understand much. I glanced at the salutation and saw it was signed from Darko. Another old boyfriend? But this name didn't ring any bells. I returned the letter to its envelope and tossed the bundle back to the bottom of the wardrobe. I'd make sure to come back and decipher them later. How did you go? Mum asked as she rushed in. There's nothing here that will fit me. I shut the wardrobe doors. Nice try. Mum opened the doors. No way! I cringed as Mum held out the dress to me. And that's how I ended up at the Zabawa, without a speck of makeup and wearing the dorkiest outfit in the history of female fashion. Nice dress, snickered my cousin, Adnan, as I sat in the chair next to him. I stiffened. His sister Marisa gave me a dismissive once-over. She was wearing a silver silk suit jacket and skirt that was fitted around her tall, willowy body. She'd managed to toe the line between modesty and good taste without looking frumpy. Unfortunately, I wasn't so lucky. Adnan pinched a fold of fabric between his fingers. For your birthday, I'll get you a subscription to Vogue. I went red. It was one of Mum's conservative dresses. On her, it was a knee-length fitted dress with a scooped neckline and almost skin-tight. But on my thinner frame, the hem reached my calves, and the scooped neckline was too low, so Mum had insisted I wear a top underneath. I looked like an op shop reject. Read between the lines, buddy. I lifted my hand, joining my thumb and little finger, and keeping my other 3 fingers in a straight line. I caught my aunt's eye across the table. Guiltily, I put my hand down by my side. You look nice. I forced a smile. Thanks. Adnan smothered a laugh. I elbowed him. Having a family was way overrated. I examined what other people were wearing. If you say you're Muslim, most people go to the stereotype of the turban-wearing, bearded Arab man or the hijab-wearing, subjugated Arab woman. They don't get that there are 1.5 billion people practicing Islam in 57 languages, and that each ethnic group had a different way of expressing their religion. Since the Balkan War, people know of Bosnia, but they don't know about Bosnians. They don't understand why women aren't covered up and men aren't turbaned. I hadn't known either, But since Dido moved in, his pet project was to educate me about my roots. He told me that Bosnians were ruled by the Turkish Ottoman Empire from the 15th to early 20th century, that most Bosnians converted from the Bosnian Church to Islam. As a result, we have a lot of Turkish words in our vocabulary and dress like Turks in Western fashion. Most of the people at the Zabava wore regular clothes. The men were in suits, and the women wore loose clothing with no skin showing. There were a few older women who were covered up, but instead of the hijab, they wore a headscarf. Single young men wore jeans and a shirt. Adnan said he'd tried to do the same, but Auntie Zehra ordered him to change into a suit. Mum waved to someone. I turned and groaned. Safet and his sister Safeta were making their way to our table. It was the Bosnian tradition to use one name in the family and add variations to it, the most popular being adding an A to make names female. "Salam alaikum," Mum said, uttering the Arabic greeting, "Peace be unto you." "Alaikumus salam." Safet returned the greeting. Bosnians speak a southern Slavic language, like most people in the Balkans, but they use a few Arabic words and greetings that they learnt, because all Muslims pray in Arabic. Mum introduced Safet as her special friend. In private, she called him her boyfriend, even though they'd only been going out for a month. I was reserving judgment. The men shook hands with Safet, my uncle Hakia making a point of greeting him with Zdravo, hello, to needle my grandfather. Uncle Hakia was still a fervent communist and a thorn in Dido's side. Dido explained that it was an insult to use non-Muslim greetings among Muslims. These were reserved for mixed company only. I turned to find Safeta standing behind me, holding out her arms. I leaned in for the kiss on the cheeks, another custom. We were pretty relaxed about it. I used to have a Turkish friend, and I'd never seen so much cheek kissing in my life. They have the whole three-kiss thing down pat. We used to do the three-kiss thing too, but we dropped it because the Serbs have the same practice, with their three-fingered crossing of the chest. Usually I managed to avoid kissing, but Safeta was trying to impress and was overcompensating. She thought she had to win me over. She didn't know that Mum's boyfriends never lasted, and that I'd stopped caring one way or another. Safet and Safeta sat on the seats we'd been saving for them. Dido watched Safet with approval. Safet used to be a university professor before the war and was considered a catch, even though he worked as a taxi driver in Australia. That is, when he chose to work. Soon after the preliminaries, they moved on to their favourite game. Safet and Safeta were originally from Prijedor, while Mum's family came from Banja Luka, which was roughly an hour away. "Do you know Ismail Shahovic and his wife Hosna?" Safet asked, ash hanging off his cigarette. My auntie and uncle looked blank. "He has a daughter Esma and a son Farouk," Safet's sister added. Auntie and uncle shook their heads. They could keep this up forever, trying to find a tenuous link, a friend of a second cousin whose mother was related by marriage to their grandfather 5 generations back. When I called this the Connect the Bosnian game, my mom told me off. She said that in Bosnia, everyone knew his or her neighbours within a 20-kilometre radius. Bosnia and Herzegovina was roughly half the size of Tasmania and had a population of 4.1 million. So even if you were dropped on the other side of the country by direction-challenged aliens, chances were you'd find people who knew someone you did. Now that everyone was scattered to the 4 corners of the world, This was the only way they had of learning about their former neighbours and creating a sense of community. They also trawled the telephone directories, looking for possible relatives. When they found someone with the same surname, they'd call to sniff out if there was a family connection. Mum told me that Bosnians who arrived in Australia during the 1970s were desperate for kinship, and that anyone with the same surname would become a cousin, whether they were a blood relative or not. Now that there was a larger population, there was no need to settle like that. As they talked, I opened my bag and found my mobile. I typed in a message. "Hope you're having a better time than me. Love, Sammy." I scrolled to Kathleen's name in my address book and pressed send. Kathleen was my best friend. We were friends since primary school, when Mum and I lived in Thornbury. During the summer holidays, we still saw each other regularly. She visited me once, but my grandfather was less than welcoming, so mostly I travelled down her way, and we met in the city or hit the op shops and cafes around Brunswick Street in Fitzroy. In the weeks since I started Year 10 at my new school, St Albans High, we hadn't spoken much. I was used to seeing her every day, and then we'd call each other after school or send an email or text message. I missed her. I returned my mobile to my handbag. When I turned back to the conversation, they were talking about the war. Again. I was so sick of hearing about the war. "I was on the front line," Uncle Hakia said. "That's where I got injured." He touched his stomach. There was a collective sigh by the group. There weren't many men who could claim hero status. Most men fled with their families when the war broke out. When he arrived in Australia, Uncle Hakia had surgery to repair the damage to his gut. He attempted working for a few years, but his health was frail, and he was in too much pain. Now he tended to the garden and ran errands, while Auntie Zera and my cousin Marisa, who was 20 years old, worked as cleaners. In Bosnia, Hakia had been a veterinarian, and Zera was a nurse. "I lost my wife and 2 daughters. My oldest would be Sabiha's age." It was Safet's turn, and he glanced at me. We all shook our heads on cue. "My fiancé was a police officer in Prijedor. After Serbs seized the city, he was arrested, with all the other officials and non-Serb leaders. I never heard from him. They were probably sent to Omarska," Safeta said. We all looked down, remembering the television images of emaciated men staring at the camera through steel fences. Omarska was the Serb-run concentration camp in which Bosnians were imprisoned. The Bosnian equivalent of Auschwitz. Even though I was sick of the constant talk about the war, when I remembered those images, I realized why they couldn't let it go. I turned away and watched the Bosnian folk dancing on what passed as the dance floor. When Mum talked about attending the Zabava, I imagined a fancy ball. Instead, we were in a high school gym. There were folding tables and plastic chairs laid out in long rows from one end of the gym to the other, with a walkway in the middle. In the canteen attached to the gym, the women were making food. Heavy clouds of cigarette smoke hung over the tables, blending with the smell of sweat, onions, and cooked meat. On the stage behind me, a folk band were producing an ear-piercing tune. Some people would call it music, but I wasn't one of them. While I watched the folk dancing, it had seemed deceptively easy. Dance in a circle holding hands, as if you're in a conga line, and shuffle your feet in a quick 2-step. But, for some reason, I lacked the necessary rhythm to transform the simple moves into a high-spirited jig. When I tried dancing, it looked like I was jumping on a pogo stick. Mum had natural rhythm. Her cheeks were flushed, a wide smile on her face as her feet kicked in unison with the other dancers. As we walked back to our table, a man stared at us. "Isn't that Mustafa?" I asked Mum as we sat. "Another ex-boyfriend." He'd lasted nearly a year and was one of the rare guys I'd liked. I smiled and lifted my hand to wave. "Don't!" Mum slapped my hand down. "He's with his wife." A little girl about 8 years old sat on his lap. His wife noticed me staring. I looked away and met my aunt's gaze. Auntie Zara cast Mum a scathing look. Mum blushed. Auntie looked like she was about to get stuck into her sister. "I'm hungry," I exclaimed loudly. Uncle Hakia and Adnan stood to get chavapi and soft drinks for us to eat. I loved chavapi. The grilled skinless sausages made with minced beef or lamb, garlic and spices served on a Turkish roll with diced onion. While we were eating, they resumed their conversation. Uncle Hakia had a toothpick between his lips. "The war happened because of who we are. It's backward the way that everyone's identity is decided by his or her religious beliefs. We call Bosnian Catholics Croatians, or Orthodox Bosnian Serbs, even if their family has lived in Bosnia for centuries." Uncle Hakia's theory was that there were no problems when former Yugoslavia existed under communist President Tito, who led the partisans to defeat the Nazis in World War II. It was only when Tito passed away in 1980 and communism was eroded that tension started simmering as everyone sought independence. Tito thumped the table. "Those Orthodox Bosnians are Serbs. If they weren't, why did they rise up in the coup d'etat even though they'd been living in Bosnia all their lives?" "Just like you were a Muslim all your life." Uncle Hakia made a dig at Dido's previous life as a communist. Dido was now a born-again Muslim, like most of the Bosnians since the war. "I did what I had to do," Dido defended. "It was the only way to make a life." While those with religious beliefs weren't persecuted in Yugoslavia the way they were in other communist countries, they weren't promoted at work and given opportunities that Communist Party members received. Safet clapped Dido on the shoulder. "Come on, friends, let's talk of happy things." Auntie Zara covered Uncle Hakia's hand. "We came to have a good time, not rehash old arguments." Dido and Uncle Hakia engaged in a staring contest. Safet and Safeta finished eating and left to speak with friends at another table. Mum picked at her chavapi. "Do you want it?" she asked Uncle Hakia. He broke the stare, smiled, and shook his head. Auntie Zara narrowed her eyes at them. "You were always wasteful, Bahra." Using a fork, she transferred the chavapi to her plate. "You need to eat more." She bit into a chevap and chewed it with relish. Mum scrunched her nose and watched Safet as he worked the room. "I need to watch my figure." "If you put meat on your bones, you'll be able to keep a man." Auntie Zara followed Mum's gaze. "Not all men like big women," Mum replied. Uncle Hakia pinched the roll of fat bulging over Auntie Zara's skirt. "You should watch your figure too." She slapped his hand, hard. "You should keep your eyes off other women's figures." Uncle Hakia rubbed his hand. "I was joking." He didn't mean anything by it, Mom said. You're in your 30s, yet you're as vain as a teenager, Auntie Zara attacked Mom. Even though Auntie Zara was 42 years old to Mom's 37, she was right. Mom looked like she was 20-something. She did push-ups and sit-ups every night to keep her figure trim, while Auntie Zara's weight aged her face, and the frumpy clothing she wore made her look like a senior citizen. Auntie Zara kept going, pointing at Mom. And you're dressed like a whore! Mom's only fault was that she looked too good. Her knee-length dress fitted against her curves, and her cleavage was just visible. After over 50 years of living under communist Yugoslavia, there were only a few customs Bosnians practiced in their everyday life that identified as Muslim. The names they gave their children, drinking Turkish coffee, and the fact that male children were circumcised. Since the war, they were groping for a newfound sense of identity after being pigeonholed as Muslim. And while many of them didn't know how to be Muslim, they knew what didn't make the grade and what got gossiped about. Skimpy clothes, drugs, and pairings with non-Muslims were at the top of the hit list. Mum had already received 2 out of 3 strikes. Mum picked up her glass and took a sip, her hand trembling. She wasn't good at confrontations. That's not... I interrupted my aunt. Adnan pinched me under the table. Ouch! I exclaimed. Leave them to it, he whispered. She's my mother, I whispered back. She's her sister. I was about to speak, but he held up his fingers like he would pinch me again. Uncle Hakia held Auntie Zara's hand and looked at Mum. Bahra looks nice, he pronounced. Auntie Zara's face was flushed, and rivulets of sweat trickled from her temple. Keep your eyes to yourself. She dug her nails into Uncle Hakia's hand. Zara, Dido snapped. This isn't the time. Mum and Auntie Zara's bickering went back nearly 20 years ago, when Uncle Hakia was courting Mum. Everyone expected that they would marry, but then my father came home from Australia to find a bride. Mum ended up marrying my dad and moving to Australia. Auntie Zara and Uncle Hakia married and stayed behind, and there's never been peace between the 2 sisters since. In the quiet afterward, we heard a hushed whisper at the table behind us. That's the woman who's crazy! A woman at the table behind us scowled at Mum.